You know, we're always, as storytellers, we're trying to have the audience travel with you on this journey. It's either conscious or subconscious. You really can't put your finger on it, but I just know that shooting in the large format, it gave me an opportunity to evoke an emotion.
For Rhinestone Blue, we used the large format. The first driving sequence is one of those shots that the large format actually is going to come quite handy, because when we were shooting it, we could tell that the image was a little shaky because we were going on the longer end of that lens, and we were tracking along basically on the ground. And as stabilized that arm is and as stabilized the camera is, we still had a bit of a shake. Now, because of the high resolution, it will be no problem to push in a little bit and stabilize the image.
The beauty of this full-frame sensor, which means a couple of things. Firstly, you get fantastic shallow depth of field when you want it, and also you can put anamorphic lenses on it.
I've always liked anamorphics. It helps us make sure the audience is seeing what we want them to see. So to have anamorphics combined with a full sensor camera, wow.
One area where we found that large format is really beneficial is working with volumes like this one. Same image size as Super 35, a large format image is going to throw the background out of focus more quickly, and that allows you to work closer to the volume and worry less about capturing moire and seeing the individual LEDs. It hides the fact that you're working in front of a volume more easily.
There are aesthetic differences with full format compared to Super 35, and a couple of the things that people point out and that I've noticed is the feeling, the emotion that it emits and how your viewer might feel in relationship to your talent, to your character, whether that be a real person or an actor. On full format, we can have the same angle of view, and in order to achieve that, we can be much closer to the talent. So we're creating much more of an intimate scene, and yet still have shallow depth of field as opposed to using a wide focal length.
Well, in cinematography, for like 100 years, we've been using Super 35 or 35 millimeter or something close to that in terms of frame size. And really it was more for a practical reason, right? Because film, they wanted to produce the same type of film for photo stills and for motion picture in terms of what the strip looks like and the way it's designed and the pinholes and all that stuff. But in 35 millimeter cameras, you had to modify it because it ran up and down, right? So you were stuck with a relatively smaller frame size. But throughout the ages, I think people have tried to get larger formats. It's nothing new. I mean, yes, we now have full frame cameras or VistaVision style cameras today in the digital space, but we already had this in analog.
VistaVision, going back to the middle of the century, on film was wildly popular for a short time. And just the cost of it just tapered off, and it sort of faded away for the most part. It was still used for specialty applications. You had VistaVision and much larger formats like IMAX, iWorks, that sort of thing. So as a format, it's nothing new.
Inherently, full frame back in the day was more expensive. IMAX was a film format that ran like 65 millimeter or 70 millimeter sideways to get a really large, tall image that is very much coveted for the big screens. And of course, we also had the Paramount version, which is the VistaVision format, because they were more efficient. Instead of going to 60 mil or 70 mil, which was much more expensive to process all that film, they went with 35 millimeter and ran that sideways. So it was relatively larger than Super 35, but not as big as maybe 65 mil or 70 mil, but quite large on its own. And that was VistaVision, aka full frame, because it's about the same size as full frame still photography.
But for digital cinematography, the Canon 5D Mark II, that was the catalyst. That's what really put full frame motion picture digital acquisition on the map. After that, the Sony A7 really pushed it forward. You know, the 5D was the introduction, and everyone said, wow, this is amazing. My depth of field is beautiful, it's cinematic, like 24 frames a second. And then Sony took it a step further and totally revolutionized full frame. So before the Venice existed, before the LF, before Monstro, there were thousands and thousands of cinematographers shooting beautiful content on something like a little Sony A7. You could see that turning point in the digital full frame revolution with the 5D and the A7 as almost the proving grounds for this format as a tool for cinematographers. They said, okay, this works, people are using it, it's doable, now let's take this format and pair it with all the features that professional high-end cinematographers need on a daily basis.
In all, digital is much less expensive when you're dealing with these larger formats. You don't have to have more film to shoot a larger format. You have to have a little bit more hard drive space. But with the compression technologies the way they are and the way resolutions work, you know, it's not a lot more data actually. Now a lot of those kind of technical issues no longer exist. Now you have the exact same camera size as before, but now you have a larger sensor in that camera. And the body of the digital camera systems are not growing just because you got a larger sensor. They're still about the same. So if you can use this digital technology at a reasonable cost and you get a larger frame, what are the benefits you're getting from that? Well, many, okay? First of all, cinematographers are automatically getting a shallower depth of field. And everyone thinks that's because of the larger format or the larger sensor size. That's not why. It's because you're gonna have to use a longer focal length of lens on that larger sensor to get the same angle of view that you're used to.
In order to achieve that same field of view, now we're gonna be on an 80mm lens instead of a 50mm lens, or even tighter depending on the size of your sensor. So you're almost doubling your focal length. So all of a sudden, you now have the ability, if you're shooting at the same stop, but on a longer focal length, you're going to compress your depth of field, have a shallower depth of field, and have more of the background out of focus.
Which is exactly what we call cinematic, right? As soon as the background has a soft focus, you focus on your subject matter and the things that are helping tell the story in the foreground. That's when you start getting that cinematic look. If I use a larger frame size with a larger format, and then I use a longer focal length of lens. And that combination is what people are looking for in terms of the full frame look. So a part and parcel of the format, is just much easier to get that cinematic look.
There's something very profound about seeing a wide shot where the background is out of focus. And the subject is, you know, you can see a lot of the subject, but the background is clearly a separate plane. There's something about our sense of depth, and I certainly feel this in myself, that it communicates very strongly to me that there's something different going on.
It's a tough job for the ACs. I work with so many DPs who we like to call the princes of darkness, who insist on shooting at, we have 1.6 and 1.3 lenses, and they want to be there now so that there's absolutely no depth of field. And worse yet, in today's world, where even in feature films, we're not getting rehearsals, we're not getting time for marks, and well, let's just try this one. Let's roll on the rehearsal. You're either on or you're off. The challenge really in the large format is more for the camera assistant than for anyone else.
If you don't want soft frames, give your ACs a fighting chance. Because on a full frame camera system, as you use longer focal lengths of lenses, you're dropping down your depth of field anyways. There's no reason you have to shoot at T1.5. You still need the human touch, because focusing is an art form. It's not automated. So even though you might have these tools that tell you what's going on in the frame or what's in focus, Preston has wonderful tools. All the other companies have wonderful tools to figure out, what's sharp and what's not. But at the end of the day, it's still a choice of where you put that sharpness. And you're giving less choice to your AC when you're forcing them to work within a very, very shallow focus area. And it might not even be conducive to your story. So you really have to pay attention to that, to see is nose to ear, is that what I want for this comedy? You're gonna be stuck trying to find that focus all the time, and it could be distracting for the audience because they wanna see the bigger picture. That's the time to really think about, why am I shooting it wide open? And remember that you have things called lighting.
But I think one of the things to be careful with the large format is that you're intending the drop off in focus or the opposite. I found that working at a 4 stop to a 5/6 stop was the optimum in the large format photography. I liked the visuals more when I was closer to a 2.8 at night, and I really like the visuals between 4 and 5.6 in the exterior work.
One of the things with DXL2, not only going large format sensor, so we have that option, but then also a native 1600 ISO. So really, if you wanted the geometric properties of a longer focal length, but you didn't want the shallower depth of field, we have, a higher base sensitivity, allowing you to stop down a stop. So if you stop down a stop, all of a sudden you can get your depth of field to be the same, or not. So that's again, the beauty of this large format, is it just gives you the option to, you can shoot large format and have it look like Super 35. Hard or sometimes impossible to shoot 35 and have it look like large format.
The thing that's nice about big sensors is it's possible to actually get more true resolving power, the ability to actually make better quality photo sites, potentially more resolution, because you're not making smaller, junkier photo sites that are actually, where each one has less value. You can actually expand the canvas instead of using a fixed canvas and shrinking the photo sites.
So let's take a look at a camera system where the pixel sizes don't change based on format, the Alexa system. If you have the Alexa Mini, right, which is Super 35 capable, and then you have the Alexa LF Mini, large format Mini, which has a full frame plus size, an open gate, which is actually about the size of VistaVision. And both of them have a different resolution. So the one LF camera is 4.5K, and then you get 3.4K on the Alexa Mini at its highest resolution. They're both going to display on the same 4K TV or monitor. So even though I have a larger frame size and more pixels with the Alexa LF Mini, it's going to shrink down to show on the same screen, right, in UHD. Same thing with the Alexa Mini. So what will end up happening is, relatively speaking, the pixels, which are the same pitch between the two cameras, there's no difference in the size of the pixels within the sensor, they're both going to display on the same TV, so the LF will have to shrink more, that image. It'll down res more to get to a 4K image compared to the Alexa Mini. So in reality, your pixels will be smaller, your grain will be smaller, your noise will be smaller.
So with the DXL, when we were looking at sensor size and options, the other advantage of going large format is we actually used a similar pixel size and then just made a larger sensor, which gave us also, in addition to the larger format, and all those advantages, it also gave us higher resolution.
So if you're actually using the resolution, it could be good for visual effects or, extractions and cropping and stuff like that. And then if you're not, if you're just shooting a normal movie where you're using the entire expanse of the sensor just to shoot a normal shot, then maybe you're not getting the resolution advantage, but that resolution advantage becomes a noise advantage because you average down the noise over more pixels.
There are definite advantages to larger sensors when it comes to dynamic range and color, because photosites can be bigger. A bigger photosite will allow you to keep the signal level from the incoming photons well above the noise floor in the sensor. And that noise floor governs a lot of things. It affects dynamic range, because the farther you can see into shadows, the more you can balance your dynamic range between highlights and shadows and really keep the range broad. Noise tends to really mess up color. If your emphasis is on really high quality and very subtle, say, gradations of hues, noise can get in the way of that in a big way.
Aside from the depth of field situation or the fact that you're using a longer focal length lens, just the mere fact that sensor itself will reduce its size to fit your TV screen, and you're using a larger sensor to get to that size, it will give you less grain, it will give you less noise, it'll give you a cleaner image, relatively speaking. And it'll be very pretty to work with. And you can use more flawed lenses with it, to tell you the truth, because you have a much bigger image now that's going to shrink down. So you can use lenses that have nice characteristics, for example.
So I think typically when we talk about large format, a lot of times we're thinking about spherical, but obviously large format also is beneficial for anamorphic as well. So in addition to the sensor being wider than Super 35 and a larger diagonal, it is also taller than Super 35. So this gives us the advantage now of having all those same characteristics we were talking about also applying to anamorphic.
With a full format sensor, you have the different horizontal and vertical, so now it allows you to use the classic 2x anamorphic glass, whereas traditionally with a Super 35 digital cinematography sensor, we have a 16:9 sensor, so that's when you use 1:3:3 glass. There are certainly Super 35 cameras out there, like the Alexa 4.3 and other ones that do have sensors that you could use the 2x, but just as a general, we aren't always able to use all the anamorphic glass out there that was, invented for a 4.3 film sensor.
I'm a huge fan of anamorphic lenses. In my opinion, you get a better angle of view to magnification ratio, and it allows us to shoot longer focal lengths and see more people. While prepping horse latitudes, we tested a lot of different lenses. Well, there were a lot of scenes with 3 to 5 people in them, and there were a lot of beautiful vistas, and we really wanted to take in the French countryside. So, while shooting with a great portrait lens, we were also able to see our sets, see the other characters. When we decided to go anamorphic, we knew that we would want a camera that could provide us 4K. So yeah, the benefit of the large format is that you get a 4:3 image area to use 2x anamorphic lenses and get the maximum out of the lens.
And I think one of the really interesting things that we kind of learned with some of our vintage anamorphic lenses was the characteristics that people really love about a lot of anamorphic is generally it's the edges, it's the outside, the center. There's a sweet spot of the lens which gives you kind of, it's in focus, it's kind of optically correct, but then a lot of the characteristics, especially in our vintage anamorphics, you get this really unique characteristics that start to come on the edge. And that was one of the problems actually in early digital photography for cinema, was that there were a lot of the sensors weren't even the full height of 4.3, Super 35. So we were taking this beautiful anamorphic lens and cropping this subsection out of it.
Now with full format, it does allow for the cinematographer to really choose if they are using anamorphic, if they want to use one of the newer designed or a classic 2x anamorphic.
Ironically, you have here behind a BL with these Zeiss lenses. That was exactly the camera that I used to shoot Home Alone. In most of my career, when a wide screen was required, I used Super 35, and I think the last film that I shot in Super 35 was Wedding Crashers. Since Wedding Crashers, the bigger comedies that I've done, and now up until recently, I've shot with the regular Alexa camera, and then I got the opportunity to shoot the large format with the Alexa 65 camera on a film called After the Wedding, which we shot in 2019. Beautiful actors. It starred Julianne Moore and Michelle Williams and Billy Crudup, directed by Bart Fernlich. I immediately loved the possibilities that this larger format could give me. This was a very personal, intimate story, and we wanted to explore what that would be like on a large format by changing things up a little bit. We wanted to get close to the characters, but I didn't want to distort the image. I wanted it to be personal, and I didn't want to lose the background. In doing so, I think the story becomes more immersive. The other thing I loved about the large format was that having this bigger canvas, it gave you the opportunity to block within the frame more. And because of that, the large format is a very positive way of approaching the storytelling. I really enjoyed the experience. I think I learned a lot about what this format can do. And there are parts of this movie that I really love that feel right to the storytelling, that feel right, and that sort of work with our approach.
There's no magic to it as far as I can tell. There's lots of theories that say you use longer focal length lenses and large format for wider shots so there's less distortion, and there's all these ideas about it. I've tested everything I could. I've tried to verify all of these, and I haven't found anything more complex than if you try to capture the same angle of view as you would on a Super 35 camera, the large format camera would just give you less depth of field. It's very simple.
I think that there's some very enthusiastic misinformation going on right now. And this isn't to disparage sensor size. I'm not saying that a big sensor is bad. I'm saying that some of the things that's being touted for, or attributes that's being touted as having, are simply not true. You know, you sometimes hear like a sort of word salad of, you know, you can put it on the same lens, but it's wider, so when it's closer, then the image is bigger, even though it's the same size when it's closer or something. And you're like, wait, what? What are we? What's the claim that is out there that I believe is you know, comes from superstition that's not substantiated by the actual facts, is that there's an optical look, that you recognize this big look separate from resolving power or anything. And that's, I mean, it's simply not true. Perspective, you basically have perspective, image size, and lens distortion. And perspective is literally just where do you put the entrance pupil. That's it. It doesn't matter what kind of camera you use, or even if you use a camera. Everything from vanishing lines to how foreground objects obscure background objects, all these things that you kind of hear people, at least implicitly or explicitly, claim is being altered by the format size. I mean, it's simply not true. We know that the point in space is the only thing that determines perspective, and then it's just how much do you see from that perspective, which is angle of view. And I think people sometimes they get confused because to get the same angle of view on a different sensor size, you need a different focal length lens, not the same focal length. And then sometimes people get confused because they calculate the equivalent wrong, and then they say it looks different. If you shoot at the actual equivalent f-stop, not the same f-stop, you will have the same blur circles. So if you're shooting at a 4 on your 36 millimeter, then traditional motion picture 35, which is 24 millimeters, you could get the exact same blur circles at just under 2.8, at 2 and something. If you put the camera in the same place and you shoot with the equivalent lens and aperture, not the same, but the equivalent, so that you have the same angle of view and the same blur circles, then the image is basically the same. The only thing left is lens distortion, which isn't specific to one format size, it's specific to a lens model.
By going with a larger sensor, we can now shoot on a longer lens. So all of a sudden, a 24 mil lens is a really wide lens. So now we have the optical characteristics of a longer focal length, so we have straighter lines, faster apertures, but we're getting the field of view of a wider lens. We can get a 12 mil, we can get an 8 millimeter, lens on Super 35 to get this really wide field of view, but it comes at cost, right? So it comes with distortion, it comes with a slower aperture because there's more elements to be able to capture that image and then try to correct it as much as possible. So that's where we lose the speed and we have this geometric distortions.
New crop of large format sensors are demanding larger format lenses. The motion picture lens manufacturers are making lenses dedicated for 35mm full frame VistaVision, but there's still an entire century worth of Super 35 glass out there that is usable for full frame, whether it's choosing a slightly cropped area on your sensor or using something like an adapter that takes that Super 35 image and expands it to a larger format like full frame or VistaVision. Once again, there's still downsides. You're still losing light, you're still magnifying your focal length. There's no special magic bullet. There's going to be a downside to it's always a compromise. When you're using an image expander like a 1.7 or a 1.4, it's still, your lenses are still bound by the laws of physics. If you're taking a Super 35 image and you're quite literally blowing it up to full frame, you're not creating photons somewhere in the middle there. You're stretching those same photons over a larger area, which means you have less light. So when you pair, for example, something like this Cabrio 19-90 with an expander, the magnification of that expander dictates how much light you lose. So at 1.7 you'll lose about 1.5, the 1.4 you lose about 1 stop. And therein lies the downside. If you're using a larger format lens that's designed for full frame, these are both T2.9, but if you put the expander on this one, which is Super 35, to cover full frame, you're going to lose a stop and a half of light. So the dedicated full frame lens does have its benefits, but if you're using a lens that you already have and you don't mind the light loss, or if you're using a vintage lens and you're trying to maintain a specific look or a specific character, then an expander is an excellent alternative. Angenieux has taken it a step further with what they call their IRO technology, interchangeable rear optics, which is in a way similar to incorporating an expander, but really what they've done is they've designed lenses so that you have a desirable aperture in full frame mode, something like T29 or thereabouts, but in Super 35 it's even faster because you have a smaller image circle. So it's not, in the case of the Angenieux, it's not that you can remove the rear section and it still produces a Super 35 image. You need to remove the rear section and then put on a Super 35 rear group, or rear optic, hence the IRO technology. So it's just a difference of a couple of pieces of glass that change the overall image circle and the speed of the lens to really give cinematographers the flexibility that they would want in a zoom lens.
So the interesting thing is, with lenses that are created for this full frame format, is that they're backwards compatible. You could use the same lens in full frame and on Super 35. There's nothing stopping you. People think there's all kinds of like calculations you have to make, or for some reason that we make full frame lenses differently than we make Super 35 lenses. That's not really the case. The only thing that's really different is the image circle that comes out the back is larger on a full frame lens. There's no reason why you couldn't use a larger format. And the focal length doesn't change, by the way. Focal lengths never change. A 35 is always a 35.
If you have gorgeous scenery like Chivo did on Revenant, or if you do a crazy gorgeous Western, it makes sense to be able to grab the big scapes with large format camera. But it also makes sense to have a picture that you're really not thinking about why it is that you appreciate this visual. I would like to associate the large format photography with just really good photography that evokes an emotion. So using the resolution, using, as in Roma, where it was just compositions, and that director didn't want, and cinematographer didn't want to influence too many things. He just wanted to be sort of the silent witness in the room with the very best photograph, with the very best moving picture that he could create. And the large format was the perfect application for that. I think that the pluses outweigh the negatives to the format.
So full frame, there's a lot of experimentation going on. I would encourage, cinematographers that haven't tried it for a project to go at least test with it and take a look. Don't be so concerned with these calculations of, what is the equivalency and things like that. You're gonna find actually that's not very helpful. All the sensor sizes are different from one another, so there's no straight calculation from Super 35, because when we say Super 35 nowadays, that can mean anything. There's a whole wide variety of different formats that are all called Super 35. But if you're used to shooting film in an Alexa, for example, or that kind of format, I think you'll really like what you get in full frame. It's something different. It's more akin to the human eyesight in terms of the wideness of the angle of view. So it definitely looks more realistic, great framing. You can be closer to your actors as well. There's a lot of benefits to it that people like. And I think that's why we're seeing so many, like even for television, so many shows that are using the Venice or Alexa LF or even the DXL2 that are meant for streaming or television, not necessarily feature films to be shown in theaters. They're all using this format too. So it's not a format just meant for the high end.
We've made a lot of Super 35 cameras. I think we have 10 or 11 different models of Super 35 cameras. We have 2 models of large format cameras. We have 1 model of extra large format. So we aren't really throwing our weight behind one or the other. We just think of these all as artistic choices. And we don't really care which one you use as long as you use the one that helps you do what you want to do, which is tell the story the way you want to tell the story.